Today's book is Sweden by Matthew Turner. I actually know the author. This is the first time I've ever reviewed a book in which I had some sort of connection to the author, so we'll see how this goes. I'm going to try and maintain my objectivity here. Actually, I shouldn't be saying that I know him because I've never met him in real life, but we've had some correspondence. About 10 years ago, he started leaving comments on my blog. I think he found it because we were both interested in walking around Japan. I had this series of blog posts in which I would walk around different cities in Japan and write up my experiences there. And he also had a blog in which he was walking across Japan and documenting his experiences. So he stumbled across my blog, he started leaving comments about 10 years ago, and we've, that's the connection. So I've never actually met him in real life, but I am predisposed to look upon positively people who take the trouble to read what I write on the blog and leave a comment for it. And by the way, it's a small group. There are only 3 people who have read the blog with any regularity and left me comments with it. So he's one of a select group that have actually read my blog and engaged with what I had to say. Which makes me very positively disposed to him. And in that respect, I would maybe even count him as a friend, or, at least a blogging friend as these things go. Maybe that's stretching the definition of friend a little bit, but I definitely have positive feelings towards him. Anyways, I had no idea he had written a book until he contacted me in the blog comments and said, yeah, he's written a book. Could he send it out to me? And I said, yeah, great. And this is the book. Now, I'm going to try my best to give this an objective review and, talk about what I liked about it and what I didn't like about it, just like I would any other book, and try not to pull any punches. I'm going to try not to be extra favorable to this book. That being said, I don't know. There's no telling how your subconscious can influence you without you even knowing it. It could be that I'm being softer on this book because I'm positively disposed to the author and because he went through all the trouble of sending it out to me and I don't want to offend him. Or vice versa. Maybe I'm being a little bit too hard on this book just because I feel like I've got to come up with something to criticize just because I feel like I have to, watch myself and be really objective. I don't know. I'm gonna do my best to just treat this like it's any other book, but take my opinion with a grain of salt here. Anyways, it turns out that Matthew Turner and I are interested in a lot of the same things. Something I've been talking about a lot on the blog or on this YouTube channel is my fascination with Japan in the 1960s and the student protest movement in Japan and the anti-Vietnam War movement in Japan. In fact, I just recently talked about a book regarding that. Matthew Turner, it turns out, I didn't even realize our interests were so closely aligned. But he's interested in the exact same things. But he is much more diligent than I am. He's studied Japanese. He's studied Japanese at university. I think he's done graduate work in Japan. So he is completely fluent in Japanese, and he has really researched this thoroughly in both the English sources and the Japanese sources and the historical journals, which by comparison is making my own interest in this subject look distinctly just like dabbling. I've read a book here and I've watched a movie here, and I've looked on Wikipedia, stuff like that. But yeah, he really knows his stuff backwards and forwards. So this is a historical novel which is based on real history, and it's based on, but the historical event that it's based on is there was a anti-Vietnam War group in Japan called Beiheiren, which in Japanese it stands for something like Citizens Committee to End the War in Vietnam, and then with the Japanese names that got shortened to Beiheiren. And they got international attention in 1967 for smuggling 4 U.S. soldiers out of Japan. So during the Vietnam War, there were all sorts of U.S. bases on Japan. I mean, there are still U.S. bases on Japan now, but there were a lot more of them during the Vietnam War. And so U.S. soldiers were going to Vietnam would often stop over in Japan, or they would be back in Japan for R&R or for medical treatment or whatever. And some of them did not want to go back to did not want to go back to Vietnam, and deserted. And this anti-Vietnam War group, Beiheiren, made up of Japanese citizens, helped smuggle them out of the country. They were smuggled onto Japanese fishing boats, then smuggled into the Soviet Union, and then from the Soviet Union got smuggled into Sweden. And there was a very high-profile case with the Intrepid Four, where 4 sailors from the Intrepid made anti-war statements and then were smuggled out of the country by Beiheiren. I didn't actually realize this, but although that was the most famous incident, apparently Beiheiren smuggled a number of U.S. deserters out of Japan between 1967 and 1970. So this is a historical fiction. So it's a fictional case of a number of U.S. soldiers attempting to contact Beiheiren and get smuggled out of Japan. And the story is fictional, but it's very closely based on real events. So I'm a big fan of historical fiction. I love history, but I also love novels, and I'm a little bit lazy to read like the scholarly history. So I quite like it when somebody makes history into a novel. So, if there is ever a person who was the exact target audience for this book, somebody who loves historical novels, somebody who's interested in the anti-Vietnam War movement in Japan and interested in the 1960s in Japan, I mean, it's me. Like, this novel fits me exactly. So the subject matter is exactly what I'm interested in. I will admit, however, when Matthew Turner contacted me and told me he had written a book, and this was the first novel he had written, and I had no idea previous he was even interested in writing novels, I will admit to being a little bit nervous while I was waiting for this book to get shipped out to me. Because, I was thinking, it's his first novel, he's never written anything before, it's probably going to be pretty terrible, and then I'm going to have to try and give it an honest review, and I was worried about that. But then I got the book out and I started reading it, and I got completely immersed in it. And then I realized that this was going to be no problem. Like, the guy can write, I'm going to be able to give it a positive review with a clean conscience. I do have a number of nitpicks, and I'll get to all of my nitpicks eventually. But the good news is, the book is highly readable. I mean, I knew that it was going well as soon as I realized I got completely immersed in the book. Now, when you get immersed in a book, you don't realize you're immersed while you're immersed, because you're so busy being immersed that you don't think about it. But then, I was at a coffee shop, and after I finished a couple of chapters or something, something distracted me, and I looked up from the book, and then I was going back into the book. Then I realized, oh wow, for the past couple chapters, I had been like completely transported. So I was like visualizing the scene in my head. And I had been completely caught up in the drama of what was happening to these characters. In other words, I had been completely immersed in it. And I don't want to overpraise this either, because, you know, that's a sign of like any competent author. It's certainly not unique to this one. But I guess the point being, he's a competent author. And from there, it was just a pleasant read. What also makes this book interesting, I was a little bit worried when I heard about the premise that it was going to be a little bit kind of by the numbers, you know, like a story of how these U.S. soldiers are being sneaked out of Japan, and, you know, first they go here and then they go here, and just kind of a you know, like a very mechanical spy story. What makes this book interesting, it was a couple of things. First of all, there's about 3 different plot lines going on at once. The point of view characters are there are 2 different U.S. soldiers who are in various parts of Japan. And then one of the point of view characters is a Japanese character who is a member of Beiheiren, and he's given the task of smuggling these other 3 U.S. soldiers out of Japan. 3 different U.S. soldiers than the other 2 point of view characters. So you've got all these different plot lines going on, and you know they're going to come together at the end somehow, but just kind of seeing what's going on and like, okay, how's this all going to fit together? But the other thing is that it's not just a simple spy story. There are a number of personality conflicts that get set up in this. And that also helps to hook the interest. For example, the Japanese character who is tasked with taking care of these 3 U.S. soldiers and smuggling them out of Japan. It turns out these 3 U.S. soldiers are jerks. Yeah, for lack of a better word. Like, they don't respect Japanese culture, they're very abrasive, they're confrontational, they complain about everything, they don't cooperate, and so these 3 U.S. soldiers are causing him all these sorts of problems. And, you know, that personality drama, you know, where he's trying to do his best to help them, but he's getting also increasingly frustrated with them, and you're waiting for it all to come to a boil, or for like this conflict to, you're waiting to see how this conflict gets resolved somehow. Either they're going to make their peace with each other, or it's all going to come to a boil and there's going to be a conflict. And so that kind of thing, and there's a couple other things like that happening with the other plot lines, where you're not only hooked on the drama of smuggling the soldiers out of Japan, but you're hooked kind of with these characters' personalities, and the personality conflicts help to make this a much more interesting book. The other thing I found really interesting is, again, Matthew Turner, apparently having very similar interests to me, takes this opportunity to get into a number of different areas of counterculture in the 1960s Japan. So this was also the era with student protests, when a number of Japanese universities got shut down by student protesters, and there were battles between the police and the student protesters. And this was a big thing in 1968 in Japan. So one of the U.S. soldiers ends up actually in one of the student-occupied universities and fighting the police with the Japanese student protesters. Which is a little bit of an unlikely place for an American deserter to end up in. And it's a little bit contrived how he gets into that situation, but it's acceptable. It's believable enough. You can kind of go along with it. I mean, there's like a couple different coincidences that lead to him all of a sudden waking up in the middle of the student-occupied university. But then it gives a really fascinating picture of what university life was like in 1968. And this is something that I've read a little bit about myself, And I've also heard stories from older Japanese people telling me about their university experience in 1968. The stories, for example, I mean, one guy told me he arrived to take his exams one day, and the whole university was shut down by student protesters, so nobody had to take their exams, and everybody, you know, passed their classes without any exams. That's not the most exciting story, but you know, I mean, it shows the ripple effect of these big student strikes and how they affected everyone. I had another older woman, a Japanese woman, tell me about this wonderful year she spent in 1968 when I think it was Fukuoka University. The whole university was shut down, you know, with the barricades to keep out the police, and she said, and we just taught each other. Like, you know, the students would hold the classes and do their research and kind of teach each other about the things that they thought were important. Which I always thought was a fascinating little thing that she told me. And sure enough, that makes it into here in this book. Not Fukuoka University, I think it's Nihon University. But there's this one passage in the book where they're explaining to the American soldier that, yeah, even though the classes are shut down, we've organized our own classes and now we're teaching each other. So that's fascinating, kind of getting a look inside the student-occupied universities in 1968. Another one of the characters is sent out to a farming commune. I forget the name of it. I think it's, what was it, Ichihachi-kai, which I had never heard of before. And which I was Googling it, actually, as I read this book, and I couldn't find anything on Google about it. But I'm assuming it's historical just because it reads like a real historical detail. There's actually nothing in the author's notes about that either, which is a little bit surprising because the author Matthew Turner, otherwise does a fairly good job in his history notes of saying kind of what in this novel is actually based on real history. But yeah, it sounds like it was a commune that was based on somewhat Buddhist or somewhat communist principles. That was a big, not a big thing, but that was briefly in the media in the 1950s in Japan, and which was continuing into the 1960s. So an interesting little glimpse of that. And then there's a hippie commune, which is on this island way out of the south of Japan. Because, you know, like in the 1960s in Japan, just like many other parts of the world, there was a hippie movement. Now, I initially, when I was reading this, thought that this was just an excuse to kind of touch stone with the various counterculture movements in Japan. And that's why we had this scene where the deserters go way out to the hippie commune on the island. But then, again, in the author's notes in the back, he mentioned that there was actually some memoirs from some of these Japanese hippies that talked about the conflict between the hippies on the islanders and the Red Pants, or the Red Pants was the nickname they had for the U.S. deserters because they were wearing red swimsuits when they came out to the island. So, yeah, it's interesting. As with a number of parts in the book, you are kind of left wondering, okay, this is based on real history, but how much is it based on real history? Like, how many of these details or incidents are based on real history, and how much of this is just the author's inventing stuff? And here, I guess the historical notes don't tell you everything, but I guess to tell you everything would somewhat take the game away a little bit with something like this, right? The author has to leave some mystique. But yeah, I guess the point being, apparently the U.S. deserters, there were actually cases of U.S. deserters hiding out on this hippie island in Japan and apparently causing conflict, as they do in this book. These were the three American soldiers who were very rude to their Japanese hosts and who were causing conflict. Excuse me. So yeah, all of that I found absolutely fascinating. And like I said before, the guy can write. He's good at creating a scene. He's good at transporting you to it. Without giving too much away at the end, there's some suspense scenes at the end where like they're trying to stay one step ahead of the Japanese police before they escape. And that suspense is well done as well. And again, it's one of those things where I didn't really fully appreciate how caught up I was in it until I took a break from reading. And then I was like, oh wow, I was really into that just now. Yeah, you know, like I thought, he's got me again. That suspense scene was very well done. I won't say any more with that without getting it away. Okay, into some of the criticisms and or nitpicks. The dialogue can be a little bit clunky in places. And especially clunky in places when there's exposition going on. When they're giving kind of the historical details or background information, which is put into the dialogue. Some of that's a bit clunky. Now, this is certainly not a problem unique to this author. Again, as somebody who's a big fan of historical fiction and who's read a lot of both good and bad historical fiction, yeah, integrating the historical details into the dialogue is hard to do for a number of authors who write historical fiction. And I've read a number of historical fiction books where it's somewhat clumsily done at points. So it's a very common problem, but it is an issue in this book. Sometimes the exposition comes off as clunky. Like you're like, nobody talks like this in real life. And it's almost always when the historical details are being shoehorned in. That being said, the whole reason you'd pick up a book like this is because you're interested in the historical details. I mean, it's a novel as well, but the kind of person who would pick up this novel is the kind of person who's interested in history. So, as with any historical novel, you kind of, you get what you expect a little bit. You get a lot of historical details, some of which fit smoothly into the novel, some of which fit a little bit awkwardly into the novel. But that's why you pick up a book like this anyways, is for the historical details. So, a minor complaint. Moving on to some more major complaints, and this is going to be complaints about the plot. So I can't really talk about it without spoiling some major plot details. So take this as your spoiler warning if you want to stop watching it here. Actually, before I get into spoilers, if you're going to stop watching the video here, let me just say, do this guy a favor and order the book off of Amazon. You know, he's a new author. For all my complaints, it's a decently written book. It's a fascinating period in Japanese history. And the book has a very positive anti-war message. So if you want to support a book like this that has a strong anti-war message, that details very important event in history. I mean, the thing is, a group like Beiheiren, the Japanese Citizens Against the Vietnam War Committee, this has the potential to be one of those forgotten little historical details, in the sense that when you study history in schools, it's all about the great wars and the great men, and there's a potential to overlook the positive social movements in history, like anti-war movements or civil rights movements or labor movements or, the people's movements. So I think it's worth remembering groups like Beiheiren, and it's worth remembering these struggles. And I think this book does a very good job of putting into a fictional story that's very accessible, something that would otherwise be a forgotten piece of history. Forgotten, I mean, not only in the US, but my experience in Japan was that younger people in Japan did not know this history either. I mean, the older people who lived through it did, but the younger people were largely clueless. So, yeah, it's important to remember this stuff. If you can at all find it in you to spare a little bit of money and buy this book, I'd recommend it, and you'd be helping out a new author. Okay, spoiler alert and quibbles about the plot. So my main quibble about the plot is there were a number of interesting conflicts set up in the book, but there was not a satisfying payoff for most of them. And again, going into spoilers about the plot. So there's this situation where this Japanese guy in Beiheiren is trying to help these 3 U.S. soldiers get smuggled out of Japan. And these 3 U.S. soldiers are just being increasingly problematic and disrespectful. And he's getting more and more frustrated with them. And I was waiting for this to kind of come to a satisfying resolution, but it doesn't really. Like, he loses his temper with them on the train, and he attacks one of them, and then he comes back to his senses and restrains himself. But that was it. It was not as satisfying payoff to that plot point as I was expecting there would be. I mean, I don't know what I was expecting there would be, but I thought this would kind of build in tension until there would be some sort of head-off. As well, 2 of the U.S. soldiers have tensions with each other. I believe their names are Santiago and Roberts. You get the point, you get the sense that they're always about to fight each other. And I was kind of waiting to see how that would break out, and nothing comes of that. And then Santiago hooks up with the Japanese women when they're on the island, and his Beiheiren guide really disapproves of it. And I was thinking this would lead to some big drama, but again, it doesn't seem to lead anywhere. There's a scene where the 3 U.S. soldiers go into the village and are trying to steal a chicken from the locals. And when the Japanese guy runs down, the Beiheiren guy runs down to see what's going on, there's a lot of mysterious details being alluded to. I mean, not even alluded to, stated explicitly. It's stated explicitly there's a lot of blood, but it's not clear where this blood came from. Or he's like, why is the blood all over there? How did they get the blood all over them? And whose blood is it? And yeah. These questions never really get answered. I thought it was setting up a mystery that was going to get paid off later in the book. I'm thinking maybe the reason that this never got paid off, perhaps, is because maybe these details come directly from the memoirs that he references in the acknowledgement and the author's notes, and maybe in the memoirs. Because life doesn't always have a satisfying payoff. Maybe in the memoirs these questions were left hanging or didn't get a satisfying payoff. But I think in a novel, you expect maybe the author to finesse the drama a little bit more. To say, okay, this is what actually happened in the memoirs I'm basing this off of, but I'm going to lead it to a satisfying conclusion. Now, what would that satisfying conclusion have been? Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't have written my way out of it either. But I'm just giving my complaints as a reader. It felt a little bit flat. And tons of stuff like that. A big deal is made of the suitcase one of the characters is carrying that he just will not let go of. And I thought, okay, there's going to be some big moment where we find out what's in the suitcase and why he didn't want to let go of it. What else is there? There's just all this stuff that was interesting and which hooked me, but which never got the payoff that I was hoping for. And that's my main complaint about the book. It hooked me in and kept me reading, but then when I got to the end, I was like, oh, I wanted more of a payoff for these points. Okay, other complaints while I'm complaining about stuff. Yeah, the stories, there are three different stories. They never quite come together as smoothly as I was thinking they would, but they are all interconnected in some way. Two of the stories are about soldiers who had been in Vietnam. And it starts off with them in Japan, kind of trying to contact the Beiheiren guys or trying to arrange a way to escape. And then there are frequent scenes when it goes back